This is the fire station in Candern that we were showing you last Sunday morning. We had the privilege of visiting this little town while we were in the Black Forest. Just a few days before we were there, there had been a fire at the fire station. And if you look closely, you can see the area where the fire had taken hold and actually did a considerable amount of damage there. And we asked the question last Sunday morning, so who do you call when there's a fire at the fire station? Psalm 61 to 63 are 999 psalms. They're psalms where David is in crisis. David, of course, is God's king. He's God's main man in Israel. He's the one through whom, in the main, God is working out his sovereign purposes. And yet here in these psalms in particular, David is in crisis situations. If you like, God's agent of deliverance is very much in need of deliverance himself. It's a little bit like a fire at the fire station. So who does David call? And who does David trust? And what about us? What about us when there's a fire, as it were, at the fire station, when there's a crisis in our lives? Those who are to be God's agents of deliverance, proclaiming his salvation, and yet at times very much in need of deliverance ourselves. Who do we call? Who do we trust? Last time we began with Psalm 61, where David is feeling faint and far from God, and yet the psalm ends with David knowing and experiencing God's powerful presence. And so we come this morning to Psalm 62, and we're going to read Psalm 62 together, if you want to turn to that just now. Psalm 62, and reading from verse 1. For God alone my soul waits in silence. From him comes my salvation. He only is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be greatly shaken. How long will all of you attack a man to batter him, like a leaning wall, a tottering fence? They only plan to thrust him down from his high position. They take pleasure in falsehood. They bless with their mouths, but inwardly they curse. For God alone, O my soul, wait in silence, for my hope is from him. He only is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be shaken. On God rests my salvation and my glory. My mighty rock, my refuge is God. Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us. Those of low estate are but a breath. Those of high estate are a delusion. In the balances they go up. They are together lighter than a breath. Put no trust in extortion. Set no vain hopes in robbery. If riches increase, set not your heart on them. Once God has spoken. Twice have I heard this, that power belongs to God, and that to you, O Lord, belongs steadfast love, for you will render to a man according to his work. Amen. This is God's word. Anybody like playing Jenga? Any Jenga fans, players? It's not good for caravans. So if you're up in a caravan this week, I think it's going to be windy enough as the week goes on, and certainly not for windy nights in caravans. Much better to stick to Uno. Someone gave us an Arsenal Uno, and we've had great fun with that. But picture a Jenga tower. You're about 10 minutes into the game, and lots of blocks have been removed, and the tower is starting to lean. With the next block out, the tower starts to totter. It's right on the point of collapse. You know that if anyone even touches the table at all, the whole tower will come crashing down. I wonder, do you ever feel like that? The big supporting blocks in your life have perhaps been pulled out, as it were, from under you. Perhaps things that you took for granted. Maybe your health, maybe your job, perhaps illness or the death of someone close to you. Now it feels like your life it's leaning, it's tottering. It feels even on the point of collapse, as if just one more knock and you feel it could all come crashing down. So who do you call? Who can you trust? The poet John Donne gives this advice. He says, against all attempts on your body, your state, your soul, your fame, against all temptations, tribulations and defamations, he says, say this psalm. He's speaking about Psalm 62. So how can we say this psalm or sing this psalm in the time of crisis? That's what we want to consider this morning. As with Psalm 61 last time, we're going to begin by hearing David sing this psalm. So let's listen closely. And as we listen in on David's singing of the psalm, verses 3 to 4 give us a revealing, a telling insight into the kind of crisis that David is experiencing. He says, how long will all of you attack a man to batter him, like a leaning wall, a tottering fence? They only plan to thrust him down from his high position. They take pleasure in falsehood. They bless with their mouths, but inwardly they curse. It's probably at the time of Absalom's rebellion against his father David, those perilous times, those tough times when David had to flee from Jerusalem, probably, but we can't be 100% sure. But what we can be sure of is just how vulnerable David feels here. The one who many would have seen as being so strong, right at this point is feeling weak and vulnerable. He's feeling right in the point of collapse. It's clear that he's been under attack, battered down, crushed, mainly it seems with words, with the lies, the deceit, the curses of his enemies. And here as he writes this psalm, he's feeling like a leaning wall, like a tottering fence. A leaning wall would have been a supporting wall in a house. But now this supporting wall that once stood so strong, it's bowed, it's bending. It's as if it's about to fall under the weight that's pressing down on it. The tottering fence, it would have been more like a stone ditch. We understand what that is in this country, a wall of uneven field stones without mortar. And if you batter it enough, it will totter, and it will be in the point of collapse, ready to come crashing down. And as David feels like this, he knows that his enemies are not intending to stop their attacks any time soon. He says they only plan to thrust him down. They want to level him right to the ground and to finish him off. They're intent on finishing the job and destroying him. So who does David call? Who can he trust? We could summarize David's response in these words. When I'm feeling vulnerable and in the point of collapse, God alone is the rock I can trust. When I'm feeling vulnerable and in the point of collapse, God alone is the rock I can trust. Listen to David spelling it out in the refrain of the psalm. We have it in verses 1 and 2, and then slightly different in verses 5 and 6. For God alone my soul waits in silence. From him comes my salvation. He only is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be greatly shaken. And then verses 5 and 6, for God alone. And this time he's preaching it to himself. He's saying, oh, my soul, wait in silence, for my hope is from him. He only is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be shaken. God alone is the rock I can trust. And yet we see here in the psalm that for David there were other alternatives. Glance down to verses 9 and 10, and he speaks of the other alternatives for his trust. He says, those of low estate are but a breath. Those of high estate are but a delusion. In the balances they go up. They're together lighter than a breath. David could have put his trust in man. But that would have been pointless, as he points out here, whether men of low estate or high estate. In other words, from top to bottom of humanity, including all men, man is lighter than a breath. So light that when weighed against God and the trustworthiness of God, man's side, in the balances they go up. Don't put your ultimate trust in man. And David's saying he's not going to put his ultimate trust in money or possessions either, whether that money, those possessions are gained legitimately or illegitimately. He says, put no trust in extortion, set no vain hopes in robbery. And then legitimate riches. He says, if riches increase, set not your heart on them. Don't put your ultimate trust in the security, seeming security that riches and human resources can bring. No, David's absolutely clear. In spite of all the other alternatives, it's God and God alone who he's trusting. You say, why? Why must it be God and God alone? Well, David tells us, in total contrast to these other false alternatives, he says, verse 1, For from him comes my salvation. Verse 5, my hope is from him. Verse 7, on God rests my salvation. God alone is the rock I can trust. And why? Very simply, because from God alone comes my salvation. Thinking about emergency calls, 999 calls, and who you call and who you put your trust in a crisis. Imagine falling off a wall in the Mourns, a tottering wall, one of those dry stone ditches, and perhaps others have walked on top of that wall or leant against it, and it's crumbling, and you go to stand on it and it gives way and you fall. And you call 999 and they ask you which emergency service you require, and you answer, could I have the lifeboat please? Well, that would be silly, and no one would ask for that. You know that your only hope of rescue is to ask for the mountain rescue team, Mourne Mountain Rescue. It's from them and them alone that your rescue will come. They can provide the rescue. They're the ones to be called for. They're the ones to be trusted to come and to rescue you from your place of peril. And David knows that his only certain hope of salvation is from God. And so God is the one that he calls on. God's the one that he pours his heart out to. God's the one that he rests in. God's the one that he trusts, because from God alone comes his salvation. What do we mean by his salvation? What exactly is David's salvation here that he's trusting God for? Well, listen to the words that he uses. The words that he uses here build a picture for us of this salvation that he's trusting God for. He says, my salvation, my rock, my fortress, my refuge. The words that he uses here, they're describing places of provision, places of protection, places of deliverance. We think of the rock in the wilderness. God provided water from the rock to sustain his people. We think of the rock there on Mount Sinai. Behind the rock, God protected Moses from certain death as God's glory passed by. We think of David himself, and I'm sure he thought often of that rock of escape in the wilderness when Saul was chasing him for his life, and there he was delivered from danger. David knows that his only rock, his only fortress, his only refuge, his place of provision, his place of protection, his place of deliverance, his salvation is God and God alone. How does this trust show itself? What difference does it make to David that he knows that God alone is the one he can trust, that from God alone comes his salvation? Well, look at the difference that it makes for him. He's waiting in silence. He says, verse 1, for God alone my soul waits in silence. And then later on, verse 5, he's telling his soul, now wait in silence for God. David has a quiet confidence in God. He knows that his salvation will come. He knows that God will provide in his way, in his time. He knows that God will protect. He knows that God will ultimately deliver. And it's shown in those words of waiting in silence, quiet confidence. It's completely compatible with what he's encouraging other people to do in this situation. Pour out your heart before him. Resting confidently in him also means pouring out your heart before him. Doesn't give you a sense of greatly planned speech. It's a passionate, it's an earnest pouring out of his heart before God, bringing it all to him, pouring it out before him in all of his weakness, in all of his inability to change a single thing in his situation, and then resting in him. You don't get the sense that it's an automatic thing, that he just pours out his heart before God and then from then on he can rest in him. I think that's why the refrain comes. He needs to remind himself of the one he's trusting in. He needs to remind himself to be quietly confident in his God. He trusts God in the crisis. He pours out his heart before him. He's quietly confident. He's not shaken. It's the language he uses. I shall not be greatly shaken. I shall not be shaken. I can rest firm in God. Look even how his trust increases here. As you go through the psalm, he begins in verse 2 with, I shall not be greatly shaken. The ship has been steadied. And then verse 6, I shall not be shaken. On God rests my salvation. So how does this trust show itself in David? He pours out his heart before God. I'm sure again and again. He waits in silence. He rests quietly and confidently in God. He's not shaken. He doesn't collapse. He rests firm in the God of his salvation. It's worth noting what I think is the acid test for his trust. And later we'll be bringing this challenge to us. The acid test for David's trust is he tells others to trust God also. Look at how it's not just about David. It's not just about David saying that I'm trusting God, but the proof of the pudding, the acid test for his trust, because I trust him, because I'm confident that he will be true and safe for me, because he will provide and protect and ultimately deliver me, well then I can call on others to trust in him. Trust in him at all times, O people. Verse 8. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us. And surely it's true, if we don't trust him, then we'll not tell others to trust him. You say to David, but what makes you so sure? Could this all just be wishful thinking? God's going to provide, God's going to protect, God's going to deliver you. What makes you so sure that you can trust God? What makes you so sure that salvation will come from him? What's the basis of your certainty? And David lays the foundation in verse 11. He says, once God has spoken, twice have I heard this. Here's the basis for my certainty, my trust, that power belongs to God, and that to you, O Lord, belongs steadfast love. Here's the grounds for my certainty. God is mighty. God is able. Power belongs to God. I know who I'm coming to. I know who I'm trusting. He's the sovereign, all-powerful God. But David, is that enough? You recognize at the end of the psalm here that God's also a God of justice. He's a God who will render to a man according to his work. So might not God, in all of his sovereign might, Might he not just render to you according to your work? You're a sinner, David. What gives you the right to expect God's salvation, God's deliverance, his provision, his protection? He's the God who renders to a man according to his work. So with all his sovereign might, would God not be completely justified in crushing a sinner like you, David? Just leaving you there to be finally thrust down by your enemies? But God's not just mighty. David knows that God is merciful. The power belongs to you. You are mighty. You are almighty. But also to you, O Lord, belongs steadfast love. Here's the grounds of his confidence in God. It's the steadfast love of relationship with God, of gracious covenant relationship with God. He knows that God is committed to him in steadfast love, that God has promised him, and that God is true to his word. And so as we listen to David sing the psalm when he's feeling vulnerable, on the point of collapse, we hear him say, God alone is the rock he can trust. And why is he trusting God alone? Because from God alone comes his salvation. God is mighty. God is merciful. But what about me? And what about you? What about us in those times that perhaps we've been thinking about, even in this message, when we're feeling vulnerable, when we're feeling weak and frail, perhaps as if we just can't take any more, on the point of collapse? Can we too call on God? Can we trust God? Can we trust him to deal with us ultimately in might and mercy? Can we trust him to be our rock, to be our fortress, to be our refuge, to be our salvation, to be our means of provision and protection and ultimate deliverance? Or could God just render to us according to our work and give us what we deserve? Well, we can only answer that when we've heard Jesus sing the psalm. We've heard David sing the psalm, but we need to hear Jesus sing the psalm. Great David's greater son. And let's listen to how Jesus would sing this psalm. Let's go to the garden and listen, where Jesus is vulnerable and on the point of collapse, as he pours out his heart before God like no one ever has. Let's go to the trial and listen, where the lies and the deceit are battering him down. He stands falsely accused and he waits in silence. Let's go to the cross and listen and watch as he is crushed, and he of the highest position humbles himself, becomes obedient to the point of death, and he is crushed and thrust down. And actually all that should have been rendered to us is rendered to him and laid on him, and Jesus is not shaken, and his resolve holds true, and his trust is firm, and he follows through. And in his might, he conquers sin and death and hell. And in his mercy, he secures our eternal salvation. He forges in blood a forever covenant relationship with his people, with all who trust in him. And now, for all who trust in him, for every single one of his believing people, we can sing this psalm with confidence. We can declare in those times when we're like that tower and we're tottering and we feel we're about to collapse, perhaps many, many times in our lives, we can say with confidence, he alone is the rock I can trust. From him alone comes my salvation, provision, protection, and ultimate deliverance. Perhaps we're leaning or tottering because of loss, perhaps because of bereavement, perhaps because of illness, perhaps because of financial struggles, perhaps relationship difficulties, perhaps opposition personally, perhaps uncertainty, or maybe just a grinding weariness. We can call on him. We can pour out our heart before him again and again. We can be confident in him. With quiet confidence, we can rest our hope firm on him and not be shaken, because on Jesus rests my salvation. And in might and in mercy, he is committed to me. He is forever committed to me in gracious, eternal, covenant relationship that's been sealed by his blood. I can be sure of his provision, his forgiveness, his peace, his presence, his strength, his grace, moment by moment, day by day. I can be sure of his protection, that ultimately no trial, no opposition, no temptation can shake my standing in Jesus. Nothing or no one can thrust me down to the ground in final defeat. I can be sure of ultimate deliverance. I can be sure of that day when the trials, the struggles, the weariness, the opposition, the temptation, when there'll be no more. God alone is the rock I can trust. There are other alternatives. They're false alternatives, ultimately. Man, in the balances, man goes up, lighter than breath. God in his goodness often provides for us in many wonderful ways through people. Don't put your ultimate trust in people. Money, possessions. God in his goodness often provides for us in finances, times when we really need them. But don't put your ultimate trust in money or possessions. Don't pin your security ultimately on your salary or your pension or your insurance. We live in a society that thinks they can insure against anything. But they're ultimately a false refuge compared to God. Are you trusting him in the crisis? Are you trusting him? Tough trust, but trusting him. And here's the challenge. The acid test for our trust. The acid test for my trust. The acid test for David's trust. He tells others to trust God also. If we trust him, we'll tell others. If in reality we don't trust him, we'll just keep quiet. Feeling vulnerable? perhaps on the point of collapse. Or maybe no one else knows that. If you're a Christian, you can pray this psalm. Say this psalm, sing this psalm. For God alone, O my soul, wait in silence, for my hope is from him. He only is my rock, my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be shaken. On God rests my salvation, my glory, my mighty rock. My refuge is God. So trust him at all times, O people. Pour out your heart before him, because God is a refuge for us.